As an educator, do you ever look at the students in your classroom and wonder if they perhaps grew up on a different planet? Because if you've ever wondered that, you would be far from alone. When the reality is we are dealing as educators with, a cohort, a generation of students who essentially have grown up on a different planet, who have grown up in an era where the pace of change means they have such different perspectives and worldviews to, in many cases, those who are trying to communicate with them as educators. I spent 3.5 years, starting back in 2004, interviewing over 80,000 students right around the world to get a sense of what is making this crop of young people tick. What is happening in youth culture, and what does that mean as you look to engage and connect with this group, be they as kids at home or employees in the workplace, but particularly as students in the classroom. And in this session, Decoding Tomorrow's Students, what I look at are some of the trends and changes we're seeing, not just in the Generation Y cohort, but also in the Generation Z group of young people who in many cases are still to make their presence known within schools and classrooms. And what I look to do is, address some of the questions that I hear from teachers as I travel around running staff development training sessions. Questions like, why do we have a generation of students who question and challenge everything, constantly asking the question why? I heard an interesting story recently of a teacher who handed back to her class a series of assignments where she had marked spelling mistakes with red pen. One of the students came straight back to her and said, "Miss, why did you mark this with a red pen? Why did you mark the spelling as incorrect?" The teacher said, "Well, because you spelt it incorrectly." The student said, "Well, but that's just the way I spell it. That's just your opinion." And this poses some challenges. We've seen a shift from the point where truth is seen as absolute to the point where we now have a generation of students who have a postmodern truth is relative perspective. That's a challenge to engage with from a teaching and learning perspective. Some of the other questions I hear from teachers, questions like, why is it that this generation crave positive feedback constantly and yet seem to do not very well when they get the opposite, a bit of negative or constructive criticism? This otherwise very confident young person just bends at the knees. They just collapse like a house of cards. Where is that from? Why is there seemingly, on one hand, a real confidence in this generation of students, but also a lack of resilience? One of the other challenges I see from teachers is they'll say, what is it with this generation and their addiction to being in contact at all times? Always got to have a mobile phone in their hand or an iPod in their ears. They've got to have stuff going on. Solitude and silence are feared. Now, the interesting thing is, the most recent data shows how much this generation can and do learn with noise. It's their natural habitat. In fact, you want to see a young person stressed out, unable to learn, think, focus, concentrate, you put them in a room on their own in silence and solitude, they'll flip out. Okay, and this is the reality. We have a generation who, according to Associate Professor Michael Rich from the Harvard Medical School, are simply wired differently. And we must respond to that as educators. So the focus of this session is what is making this group tick, but more important than just understanding not just the current generation of students, but the students who are on the way. The key in this session is to look at strategies. How do you bridge that gap and connect with today and tomorrow's students from a teaching and learning perspective? How do you make pedagogy relevant to the digital natives? But also, how do you deal with this group from a behaviour management perspective as well? How do you connect with them either one-on-one or in the one-to-many classroom setting? So decoding tomorrow's students, it's really a key for any teacher who wants to make sure they stay ahead of the curve and knows what's going on in their students' minds.